If I could ask everyone to please turn back with me to Matthew chapter 16. Matthew's Gospel and the 16th chapter, as we consider together verses 1 to 12. As the children were reminded earlier, every day we face warnings of one kind or another. Flashing lights, emergency alerts, those road signs, or the lights on the dashboard, hazardous material, health and safety, in some shape or fashion, in multiple forms, multiple times a day, we receive warnings. And in some cases, to ignore the warning is a rather minor thing, fairly inconsequential. But sometimes to ignore the warning would bring devastating consequences. But what about the myriad of warnings that are given in the Scriptures when it comes to our souls? If we know to heed warnings that deal with our physical lives, how much more should we pay attention to warnings that deal with our never-dying soul? As we resume this morning our studies in Matthew's Gospel, we do so finding Jesus confronted by a motley group of religious opponents, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. If you can cast your minds back a few weeks, you might remember Jesus. He has previously been in a Greek Gentile area, feeding a crowd of some 4,000 men, plus women and children. He has since got into a boat and has crossed to the western side of Galilee. So he's back on Jewish turf. And immediately he's confronted with these opponents. It's a fairly brief confrontation, but it ends with Jesus warning these religious leaders. The scene then moves with Jesus getting into a boat again and crossing the Galilee, and he being alone with his disciples. And to his disciples, a further warning is given. So we have two scenes in these verses. Two groups of people, both are given warnings. There's a warning to the spiritually blind, and there's a warning to the spiritually dull. And whoever we are this morning, whatever our background, each of us, we can surely identify with one of these two categories of people: the spiritually blind or the spiritually dull. So each of us this morning, we find warning for our souls. So let's look at the two scenes, the two warnings in turn. Firstly, a warning to the spiritually blind. Verses 1 to 4. A warning to the spiritually blind. And from the outset, we should find something striking here. We read in verse 1, the Pharisees and Sadducees came. And the sense is they come together. This is one group with the two parties combined within it. This is a remarkable occurrence. These two groups did not get on. Not in the slightest. They hated each other, Pharisees and Sadducees. We might be getting close in our context if we think of the DUP and Sinn Féin. Absolutely no love lost between the two. Two parties believing completely different things, standing for entirely different issues. That's the Pharisees and Sadducees. Different backgrounds, different upbringings, different levels and stratas of society. Normally, they would be at each other's throats, the Pharisees and Sadducees. but not here. Not now. All of a sudden, their squabble ends. Why? Well, because they have a common enemy. They have a common enemy. Together they come, these two opposing parties, allied together, magnetized together by their hatred towards Jesus of Nazareth. You can read how Matthew puts it. They came and to test him. They asked him to show them a sign from heaven. Now, please do not think charitably of this test. This is nothing like the minister going around at the end of the year, lovingly and gently testing the children and how they've learned their Sunday school lessons. Not at all like that. Nor was it like the workers at the MOT test centre who rigorously test your car, not because they get a kick out of it, but to prove it's roadworthy, safe to drive. There's nothing charitable about this test. The Pharisees and Sadducees, they're testing Jesus here in the hope that he will fail. They're trying to discredit him publicly. They're trying to make him look bad, much like some journalists in Scotland have been trying to do with a Christian politician this past week. They're wanting to trip him up. And so they ask him a sign from heaven. Show us a sign. Give us a sign, Jesus. And we sort of think to ourselves, how blind are these people? Because Jesus, and we've seen recently in these past weeks, he has been openly and publicly giving them signs from heaven. He's been feeding and healing thousands of people. Some of his most public miracles have just been happening. Miracles in broad daylight. So let's understand, these critics, they were not really interested in a sign. Not in the slightest. It wouldn't have mattered what Jesus could have done for them. They would have sought to have explained it away somehow. How many today are just like them? How many just like them? You maybe have met somebody or heard somebody say, if God would only give me a sign from heaven, then I think I would believe then. If only he would do something powerful, miraculous in my life, well, then I would become a Christian. But in their blindness, they fail to see plenty of signs have been given. Plenty of signs are still given, day after day after day. The evidence for God everywhere. They just don't see. And Jesus responds masterfully to these blinded, unbelieving Pharisees and Sadducees. Verse 2, he answered them, when it's evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and in the morning it will be a stormy sky, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearances of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. You might pick up in your ears there the little poem that still goes round today. Red sky at night, shepherd's delight. Red sky in the morning. Shepherd's or sailor's warning. Something similar to that. Well, this is where that little rhyme comes from. Jesus essentially says to these Pharisees and Sadducees, you men, you think you're so good at reading the weather. You think you can read the skies and the clouds. You see those heavenly signs and you can make all these conclusions. You say so and so about the weather from what you see up there. But you're so blind because you can't read the signs of the times. And to be quite frank, you men are better at weather than you are at theology. You don't have a clue. You don't have a clue. You wouldn't understand. You haven't understood any of the signs that have been given. You men, you wouldn't recognize the Messiah if he knocked at your front door. You've missed the whole thing. Mark tells us in his account that at this point in the conversation, Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit. It's a very telling phrase, a moving phrase. He sighed deeply in his spirit. What's he thinking? What's he feeling? We don't fully know. Exhaustion, emotion, frustration, maybe a mixture of them all. Here were these high flyers, the Pharisees and Sadducees. They had a deep interest in religion. They could see and understand lots of things, but spiritually they were totally blind. How many today just like them? They might be a brain surgeon who could read a complicated scan, a financial advisor who can read the markets, a computer analyst who can read all sorts of code, a mechanic who can diagnose a problem with a car just by listening to it. Capable people, competent in all sorts of ways, gifted. They can tell you a lot about a lot of stuff. But in their blindness, they haven't really got a clue what's going on in the world. And they willingly and persistently close their eyes and ears to the truth of God's word. And to such people, Jesus issues a warning. Verse 4. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it, except the sign of Jonah. I'm not going to dance to your tune, he says. I'm not going to give you a sign. I don't go around trying to convince twisted, darkened, deceptive hearts. The only sign you men will get is the sign of Jonah. Now, this sign of Jonah is a very similar phrase to something Jesus said earlier in Matthew chapter 12 and verse 39. And he speaks of the sign of Jonah there, chapter 12, 39. And there he actually goes on to explain the reference. He says, just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Behold, something greater than Jonah is here. 3 days, 3 nights. It's a reference, isn't it, to the resurrection of Jesus, the sign of Jonah. Just as Jonah spent 3 days in the fish, so Jesus would spend 3 days in the tomb. And that's the sign. That's the sign that will be given to these religious leaders, the resurrection. And of course, we know that even that sign, the sign of Jonah, that wouldn't be enough for these opponents. And when the time came, they would be the very ones who would seek to cover up the sign. They would seek to explain it away. Robbers came and took the body, they tried to say. And is it any wonder that even still today, the resurrection of Jesus is one of the most hated, one of the most attacked truths in the Christian Bible. And that's what makes surely the words at the end of verse 4 so chilling. So he left them and departed. As far as we know, this is the last time he really offers the Pharisees and Sadducees an invitation. From now on, when he meets them, it's condemnation. He left them and departed. Friends, could anything be more tragic? For the Son of God to leave you. It's one of the most precious truths for the Christian that he's always with us. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. So could anything be more tragic than this? The Son of God to leave, to depart, to abandon you in your blindness. Luke, in his gospel, tells us the time when Jesus was a child, a boy. And Mary and Joseph, they returned from the temple and they supposed Jesus was with them, only to dreadfully discover that he wasn't with them. Could it be this morning that you are supposing Jesus is with you? You are supposing he's with you. And maybe you think because you're in the right crowd or the right company or the right place that you're somehow fine. What a dreadful discovery awaits those who have never laid hold of Christ, to discover that you only supposed he was with you. So these words are a warning to those who do not know Jesus as Lord and Saviour. Stop asking for more signs. Stop asking for more evidence, more proof. It's all been given. Nowhere more than the empty tomb. Something we celebrate every Lord's Day. Quit with your excuses. Stop your hypothesizing. Enough delaying. And in the words of the angels in the tomb, come and see the place where he lay. He is not there. He has risen just as he said. A warning to the spiritually blind. A warning to the spiritually blind. But there's a further warning given. A warning to the spiritually dull. To the spiritually dull. Verses 5 to 12. Having left the Pharisees and Sadducees, Jesus has got into a boat and crossed Galilee once again. And he's followed by his disciples. And we're going to see that these men, though they weren't spiritually blind, in many ways they were spiritually dull, slow to see, slow to understand. Little faith disciples. The troubling thing we'll find is that so many of us are in the same boat with them. Matthew tells us, verse 5, when the disciples reached the other side, they had forgotten to bring any bread. And it's an important detail. These 12 men have all forgotten to bring their lunch. They catch up with Jesus, verse 6. He gives them this warning, watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. And admittedly, it's a little cryptic, isn't it? It's a little cryptic. What does Jesus mean when he says, watch and beware of their leaven? The recent confrontation is clearly still fresh in Jesus' mind. He feels the need to warn his disciples. But his disciples don't get it. The penny doesn't drop. Verse 7, they began discussing this warning among themselves, saying, we brought no bread. Jesus, we didn't get any bread from the Pharisees and Sadducees. In fact, Jesus, we didn't bring any bread with us at all. We totally forgot to. It's our fault, Jesus. It's actually a bit of a sore point. We totally forgot to bring the bread. But don't panic. There's no leaven here at all. We don't have any leaven with us, Jesus. But they've totally got the wrong end of the stick. They've drastically misunderstood Jesus. He responds, verse 8, O you of little faith. Oh, men, why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you've no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Man, I've literally fed 2 huge crowds with just a few loaves. You were there. You were there. You went out and you gathered up the basketfuls of leftovers. I'm not warning you as to where you should or shouldn't get your bread. You need to beware the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. There's something about all this that is beginning to hit home, I trust, with us. We can sense something of the despair of Jesus over his disciples. And we see ourselves in them, don't we? We see ourselves in them. We have such short memories. We're like theological goldfish. Our lives are a stunning record of God's provision, God's goodness, God's care, and so quickly we forget. And we forget and we fret about the little things in life. And we sometimes, literally, we worry ourselves sick when it comes to our cares and concerns. And so let's see here Jesus being so patient, so tender, so gentle with his confused disciples. He gently repeats himself. He explains himself again. And maybe parents of young children do well to take note. Often our children, they will not grasp the truths of the Lord Jesus the first time, or the second time, or the 100th time we teach them and tell them about them. So let's not be slow to follow Christ's example, patiently, lovingly, carefully repeating ourselves. At this time, the penny does drop. There's a light bulb moment, verse 12. Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Jesus, you see, he hasn't been talking about physical leaven, but spiritual leaven. A number of months back, we thought of the parable of the leaven in Matthew 13. To make a loaf of bread, you need just a little leaven, a little bit of fermented dough, which would act like yeast, and it would cause a reaction through the whole lump, and that's what would cause the dough to rise. Leaven is mentioned numerous times in the Bible, often describing something that is so small but has a powerful and often damaging influence. It's often spoken of negatively. It might begin small, but leaven quickly permeates and affects everything completely. And according to Jesus, the false teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees, that was something to stay well clear of. Watch out for their teaching. Do not trifle with it, he says. Do not tolerate it. Stay away from it. And the warning still stands today. Beware the leaven of false doctrine. Watch out for the kind of false teaching that can wrongly influence you. Because one of the dangers is that it's so subtle. It's like leaven, like yeast. So small, but it grows. And grows silently and invisibly and pervasively and almost imperceptibly. Beware the leaven of bitterness. Beware the leaven of unbelief. You let it take hold of you, before you know it, it can engulf you and swallow you up. A little false doctrine can grow to affect your whole mind, your whole heart. Beware this wrong, false leaven. There are theological errors, friends, falsehoods that we shouldn't flirt with. False teachers we shouldn't entertain. Books that we should stop reading, perhaps. YouTube channels that we should stay clear of. People on social media that we shouldn't pay heed to. Watch and beware false leaven. The implication in all of this, of course, is that we should positively feed on the best leaven, the good leaven, the best doctrine, the best bread. Because between the lines of all of this, there is a bread being held out in this passage. It's Jesus, isn't it? It's Jesus. I am, didn't he say? I am the bread of life. The bread of life. We're to feed upon him, his teaching, his words. The Gospels lay him out in his life, his death, his resurrection. We're to meditate upon him. We're to feast upon him. We're to feed upon him. So, in the background of all of this warning to both the spiritually blind and the spiritually dull, there's an invitation here. An invitation to the spiritually hungry, to the spiritually needy, to the spiritually empty. Come to me, Jesus is saying. Come to me. Watch and beware the false stuff. Come to me instead. Feed upon me. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. So watch and beware and come to him as he's freely offered in the gospel. Jesus, the true bread of life. Amen.